Do we want to give everyone a couple of minutes, Flavio?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the meanwhile, to those of you who have joined us, welcome.
Yes, welcome. Shall we begin, Andre?
Absolutely. On
Yes.
your command, Flavio.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Welcome, everybody. This is the keynote speaker session. We have our invited speaker, Dr. Andrei Pavlov. I just have a brief introduction. Andrei is currently a professor of strategy and performance at Cranfield School of Management, Cranfield in UK, where he got his PhD and his master's. Before he studied in the United States, he did his MBA in Bachelor of Science in Business Administration. Andrei has his main publications are in the journals like Production Planning and Control, the International Journal of Operations and Production Management, and Public Administration. Andrei, there's some information about you. If you want to add something or correct something, please feel free. And we have now, you can start your presentation. Thank you very much for being part of this SEMIAD conference. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Flavio, for the introduction. And thank you for inviting me to speak at the conference as well. Unfortunately, I've never been in Brazil. This is my first time, and it's an online time. But hopefully one day I'll be there in person as well. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to share my screen as usual and walk through the structure of this. Flavio, if you could give me just an indication whether you can see the slides.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So as Flavio mentioned, my name is Andrei Pavlov, and I'm a professor of strategy and performance at Cranfield. And so this means that all of my work is at the interaction or at the intersection of these two, strategy and performance. And so I'm quite interested in the action aspect of strategy. So how do you actually do strategy, right? How do you actually implement it? How do you execute it? And similarly, in performance management, I'm less interested in measurement and more interested in how performance management connects to the bigger picture, to strategy. And when Flavio and I talked about doing this keynote presentation, Flavio asked me to talk about both performance management and strategy. And so that's how I've structured this conversation, this presentation. In terms of the specific parts, I'll talk about the big issue, the big kind of problem that I think we are seeing in management research in general. And this is not going to be a presentation of a research study, and this is not a research paper, but this is more of an invitation to think about management and management research from a viewpoint, from a paradigm that is significantly different from the traditional paradigm that we all use and that we all teach on our MBA programs around the world. So I'll talk about the issue and the approach that we have been exploring with my colleagues. And then I'll talk about the implications of that for the research in strategy, specifically in strategic change, and then for the research implications for the research in performance management. And once we've done that, I'll walk you through the current projects, activities, and events that my colleagues and I are doing in this space. So if we think in general about how strategy and strategizing is perceived, right? The story normally starts with executives setting strategic objectives sometime in the future, and then moving the organization step by step towards achieving those objectives. That's the kind of layman's view of strategy and strategizing. And this is, of course, not an easy task. And it's not easy for a number of reasons. First, it requires the knowledge of the future. This is necessary in order to determine what will be useful in, say, 5 years' time, what the industry will look like, what the customers will want, what the suppliers will look like. And second, this task requires the executive to have the control over the outcomes of his actions in this particular case. Because only when we ensure that every organizational initiative delivers exactly what it was designed for, only then can we plot and execute the strategy implementation process. But this is not it yet, right? Because besides this, the executive also needs to have the knowledge of the present. In order to get to the desired outcome, the executive needs to understand what is valuable in the organization, what's not, what needs to change, what it needs to change to, and how the change could be brought about. And finally, this needs to have control over the people in the organization as well, right? Because people in this picture cannot be allowed to do as they please. Their actions should be aligned with the direction and the thrust of the organization's overall strategic objectives. And so if you look at this picture, here we are, right? Poised to take our organization towards a goal that will deliver value in 5 years' time. And this is a textbook example of an organization that's ready for a strategic plan and a corresponding performance management system. All we need to do is predict the future, understand the present, and ensure maximum control over the effects of our actions and the behavior of the people who are working for us. Yeah. And by way of an example, just a couple of things that might need to be worked into this plan. This is a chart of the UK's interest rates, the Bank of England interest rates since 1975. Look at the dynamics of this graph. And especially look at the huge drop in 2008. Who could have possibly predicted this? Who could have possibly predicted such a huge drop to an unprecedented low value? And of those people who could have predicted it, who could have predicted that it would stay that low for such a long time? At the moment, it's only 0.1% here in the UK. And yet, this is one of the most important determinants, right? One of the most important forces in the business environment for any organization, because this represents the cost of borrowing, the cost of money. Similarly, if we just think about a couple of years back, if we think about the oil prices, this is 2018, and this is a headline from CNBC from February. Goldman Sachs sees oil surging above $80 in 6 months' time. Right? By the time we get to July, oil prices could top 120 before year end, right? Because the market is bullish. By the time we get to December, the oil prices have dropped And America's oil producing region has a new problem, 40% crude, right? Oh, $40 crude. So if we look at the chart for the oil prices, we again see this these massive swings and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of dynamics, many of which are completely unpredictable. And who could have predicted the drop in the WTI prices below zero this year, right, on the back of the coronavirus pandemic? So there are lots of things that we can probably not predict, or at least we can't predict them well enough to work this into the plan, into the strategy execution plan and the performance management system that is designed to support it. But actually, we know this. We all know this. We know that full knowledge is impossible because every organization is a complex, unique system where people change, enter and exit the organization, customers change, new rules appear, and others cease to matter. And the way all of these things interact with each other makes prediction impossible. Even if we look within the organization, causal ambiguity makes it very difficult for us to know which assets and resources contribute to which outcomes. So we can't really attribute effects to causes, which makes it nigh on impossible to design a managerial intervention without accidentally destroying the very source of competitive advantage. And similarly, control is unattainable because the organization's history will have a large say in what futures are open to the organization. For example, having dedicated your childhood to playing volleyball limits your chances of becoming a concert pianist, doesn't it? And similarly, path dependence makes it unlikely that an efficient, for example, train operator can branch out into commodity trading or investment banking, no matter how attractive that industry is. And context will often play a decisive role in what works and what doesn't. And of course, people in the organization will always be live human beings whose ability to interpret the task, choose how to respond to it, or even whether to respond to it, cannot be engineered away. So what do we do? The idea that I want to put forward in this presentation is that we approach this task and we answer this question of what do we do based on our worldview. And when I say worldview, I don't mean a particular analytical perspective, but what I mean is a fundamental way of seeing the world. Our German friends have a word for this, a Weltanschauung, right? A very, very fundamental perspective on life. And in this presentation, I'll present two perspectives that are essentially polar opposites. And I recognize that there are connections between them, but here I'll make them intentionally very different, just to highlight how different they are in their fundamental assumptions. The first worldview is a very familiar to us mechanistic worldview. It's got its basics and its implications, right? And I'll very quickly go through these. And the metaphor, the key metaphor under this worldview is that the organization or an organization is a machine. It's a mechanism. So what does that mean? The atomistic assumption means that we can understand the world by disassembling it, by breaking it down into parts. So for example, we then have marketing people doing marketing and HR people looking after people. And then we have the sales team focusing on sales and so on and so forth. So we have functional specialization. Another assumption of this world is that cause and effect linkages are linear. So we can isolate and understand the cause and understand how it affects certain outcomes. So for example, in this worldview, and if you've been doing research and strategy, you will immediately recognize it. We're asking these questions such as, what is the effect of the balanced scorecard on performance? Or what is the effect of HR practices on performance? Right? Meaning that if we design the model correctly, we can control for all of the noise, engineer the noise away, and isolate the impact that we are after, right? To understand the effect of of the balanced scorecard on performance or of HR processes, HR practices on performance. In this worldview, we also see the world, or we assume that the world is inherently knowable. And if we don't know it at the moment, it means we haven't looked hard enough, or we haven't collected the right data or enough data. And so the assumption here, the belief here, is that we can capture and understand critical resources and processes. And even for very vague and very woolly things, like, for example, personality, we can design accurate and precise measures. As I'm sure you know, in the strategy, for example, one of the most current developments is the neuroscience of strategy, the study of the neuroscience of strategy, where not only do we try and understand the behavioral foundations of strategy, but we go even deeper inside and we look at the cognitive mechanisms that give rise to particular behaviors, in particular CEOs, right, or executives. And of course, this world, or under this worldview, the world is seen as controllable. So we can control the behavior of people and the outcomes of our actions. And if you think about how we structure compensation packages or incentive schemes, this is based precisely on this assumption that we can learn to affect the motivation of people in a very accurate and very effective way. And in terms of the implications of this, if that's true, if that's what the world is like, then we can design surgical solutions. Right? So, for example, if we have an issue with motivation, that's an HR problem. So we bring in an HR consultant. If we have an issue with understanding the market, the customers, then that's a marketing problem. And then so we bring in a marketing consultant. Never mind the fact that maybe the sales team has a massive conflict between them, right? But if they can't sell, that's a sales problem or a marketing problem. Because we see the world as functionally structured, we decompose it and we address it in a surgical, piecemeal fashion. That also means that we can see change as incremental change. We can plan it. So we can design very specific interventions and decide what we are going to change, why, and how the organization is going to be different after we implement this change. So we also know how close we are to success and failure. Under this worldview, obviously, you need to have data and you need to analyze it, right? That's where the answer is. So analysis is paramount because that allows us to predict the future and design best practices. And of course, as I mentioned before, if we can isolate performance drivers, for example, the effects of HR on performance or performance measurement on performance, then that means that we can and should control organizations. Right? So we can do it through targets and incentives. We can design rules and procedures. But the point is that we're designing the organization in a particular way. So that's a brief overview, brief summary of this mechanistic worldview. And I'm not necessarily critiquing it in the sense that I'm saying that it's wrong, but that's a particular way of seeing the world and therefore a particular way of seeing organizations, which of course, if you look at the list of implications here, which of course has an effect on how we decide to intervene into these organizations. The opposite worldview here is what I would call the complexity worldview. And it is based on complexity theory or complex systems theory, which is a theory, theory probably a theory that bridges or spans different disciplines of knowledge. And it is based on the initial insights of Bertalanffy's in general systems theory. And then it was articulated later by the Belgian scientist Ilya Prigogine, who received the Nobel Prize for his advances, for his contributions to this worldview, to this study. And at Cranfield, where I work, we like to think of ourselves as intellectual descendants of Prigogine, through the work of his student, Professor Peter Allen, who is a professor, or who used to be a professor at Cranfield. So again, a quick look at the basics of this worldview, and a look at the implications of what it actually means for organizations. The key metaphor of this worldview is that an organization is not a mechanism, it's not a machine, it is an organism, right? So it's a living entity with its own logic, with its own momentum. And if you interact with it, it will push back as well. Just like an organism, just like a live organism would. So we take a systemic view in this worldview, which means that important outcomes, such as, for example, performance, they are systemic, they're irreducible to the constituent parts. The common way of describing it, of course, is that the whole is different from the sum of its parts. And notice I don't say that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, because it could be less than the sum of its parts, because you could have synergistic effects that allow you to that allow the organization to be more than the people inside it. But you can also have internal conflicts where the final product is actually less than the sum of its parts. So if we think about things like a team or organizational culture or organizational performance, these would be systemic outcomes. Culture is a systemic outcome of the interaction between individual people. But these people inside the system are not just resources, right? They are autonomous individuals who have agency, who have free will, and they can decide how they will behave. One of our colleagues, Dr. Jim Bolton, usually describes it as people don't dissolve into the system, right? So you never quite hire, 37 hours or 40 hours of labor per week, right? You always hire a particular person with all of the associated benefits and all of the associated problems, and that person becomes a part of a team, and you don't really have an idea of what effect that person will have on the team, right? Because every part of the system is unique and is autonomous. Similarly, if we think about supply chains, we like to draw diagrams with supply chains and nodes in the networks, but those nodes are also autonomous firms with their own strategy, with their own vision, with their own preferences, and with their own plans of how they want to be part of that supply chain. So we can't really reduce it to something that's completely normal and uniform. And then, of course, these elements within the system, they're not isolated, they interact. And in interacting with each other, they change each other. And of course, this is not rocket science, and this is nothing super new, because if we think about a very, very simple, complex system, such as a team, we can immediately see that this is quite an accurate description of it. Another foundational idea here is that all social systems are open systems. And if we think about the organization, suppliers and customers are essentially part of the system. So for example, if you have a strategic supplier, in many cases, that strategic supplier will come to your meetings and will sit around the table with the rest of the executives from the organization, right? Because it's very difficult to draw a clear boundary between where the organization ends or where the supplier network begins. And the same thing with the customers. And of course, many people here at this conference are academics. If you think about our students, for example, they come and essentially live with us for a year, 2 years, or in the case of doctoral students, 4 or 5 years. We give them badges. Their badges have the brands of our company, of our university, right? And these students interact with us and change the way we think and raise questions that we would never think of. And especially in the case of, for example, doctoral students, essentially, although they are our students and therefore probably technically our customers, they're doing our R&D, right? They're doing our research with us. And so it exceedingly difficult to actually draw a clear boundary and say that we are the organization and the students are the customers, right? Because social systems are open systems. Another foundational idea here, which is very different from the mechanistic paradigm, is this idea of nonlinearity, is that the cause and effect relationship is not linear and it can actually change. So for example, again, if you remember my example with incentives, right? If we design a bonus scheme to stimulate or to improve motivation, right, it can work today, but tomorrow the person will be in a different place, right? And the person will want something different, and that that causal effect will no longer hold, right? Similarly, I'll give you an example on a global scale. If we think about one of the basic rules of monetary policy, right? You lower interest rates, you get economic growth and inflation. So you increase interest rates, and you dampen the inflation, and that has worked for decades until it stopped, right? So at the moment, central banks around the world are trying to understand what's going on as they're lowering interest rates. The economic growth is not picking up, and the inflation is not picking up. And at the moment, in many systems, in many economic systems in Europe, in Japan, in the UK as well, the governments had to do the unthinkable and lower interest rates below zero. And we're still not seeing the economic growth, right? So that cause and effect relationship that we had in the economic theory held for a while and doesn't hold anymore. And we would see complex open social systems do this, because for a while these connections stay, but then they change, right? Because the effects are nonlinear. And the final point here is this idea of the arrow of time, is that the development of the world is irreversible, and choices are irreversible, and actions are irreversible. Paraphrasing Lady Macbeth, what's done cannot be undone. And that's the idea of path dependence. Every time we make a decision, it puts us more firmly on a particular path, and it closes certain futures, or at least makes them less likely. Right? So if we think about, for example, trust, if our partner breaks the trust, that is almost impossible to restore. We can still choose to work with that person again, but of course that initial trust that was there is not going to come back. And that's the idea of the irreversibility, or the arrow of time. The arrow of time is actually a term introduced by Ilya Prigozhin in his work on complex systems. Right, so these are the foundational sort of assumptions of this worldview. And just a couple of implications then. So if systems are open systems, then that means that they're sensitive to contexts. And the context will play a major role in how the system develops. Success and failure, as I say here on the slide, are jointly determined by our action and the context, which means that, of course, standardization and best practice adoption is a very tricky thing to do, because what worked in one context may not work in another context. The idea of change, especially strategic change, also becomes quite interesting under this worldview, because if the dynamics of the system are determined jointly by the choices of people inside the system and the environment around it, then we can't really predict the dynamics of that change. And sometimes an intervention can actually be ejected, and whatever you try to do has no effect on the system. Or sometimes a very small action could actually trigger a system-wide change. And so change happens in fits and starts. And in many cases, it's unobservable, unpredictable, and suddenly it happens, right? Here in the UK, in the past few years, we've had a number of major bankruptcies, like, for example, Toys R Us or Carillion, major big organizations that if anyone walked into them 2, 3, 4 months before the event, before the bankruptcy, they wouldn't be able to see anything, right? It would be a fully functional organization until something happens, which precipitates catastrophic change, a catastrophic swing to another state. Fragile states, again, can't remember exactly the year, but several years before the crisis in Syria, if you looked at the indicators of fragile states, on the list of fragile states, Syria wasn't there at all. Because looking at what we were looking, we had no indication of the internal hidden deep processes that were going on in the country, in the country and also around it, right, in the region. And it's not a fragile state until it is, right? And it's very difficult to predict it, and it's very difficult to trace and manage this change. And finally, the big idea here is or the big implication of this worldview is the idea of self-organization and emergence. Is that it's the idea that new and coherent patterns or new and coherent relationships or structures can emerge in a completely unpredictable or unforeseeable fashion. So, for example, the classic example of this is the invisible hand of the market. Right? Nobody controls market agents or economic agents, and yet we see certain things, right? We see market bubbles, we see industries form, we see ecosystems form, we see specific, very observable, very clear patterns, and yet nobody's really directing them, right? Again, I mentioned my colleague Jean Bolton, and she's fond of giving the example of how text messaging became popular. It was never designed to be a commercial feature. It was designed to be a function for engineers testing the signal between different towers, right? Different mobile towers. Right? So they would, instead of calling each other, they would text each other. But suddenly, people realized that this was a useful thing. That became a commercial feature. We then had text message bundles woven into our mobile plans. And of course, what's going on now? We actually have messengers, right? We have apps dedicated to texting. And again, that was not a planned outcome of this, and a completely unforeseeable, unpredictable, emergent property of people interacting with the technological feature. So again, if we look at the complexity worldview here, then we have the basics and we have some implications of this. And again, the metaphor here, the key metaphor is that an organization is a living organism. So we then can choose which paradigm we follow, right? And we can then think about what is really driving our actions as we are answering the question of how we do strategy in real world and how we build, design, and operate performance management systems as well. And I think that the mechanistic worldview is a very familiar worldview to all of us. And I think many MBA programs are designed around the toolkit that belongs to the mechanistic paradigm, the mechanistic worldview. But the question that I want to ask here is, what happens if instead of assuming that the world is controllable, we choose to work with reality? And instead of treating knowability and controllability as the norm, and uncertainty and emergence as annoying and unfortunate anomalies that we haven't controlled yet, or we haven't learned how to control, what happens if instead of that, we start by admitting that uncertainty and emergence are normal and are basic features of the world, and it's knowledge and control that are occasional and temporary islands of stability in our lives. What if we flip this? What if we try and think about what management looks like under the complexity worldview? The term that my colleagues and I have chosen to use with respect to strategizing in complex open systems is guided emergence. And borrowing this diagram from a book by Gene Bolton, Peter Allen, and Cliff Bowman, I think the idea that it captures is that the outcome of our intervention in the organization will always be jointly determined by what we actually do, so the managerial actions here at the bottom, but also the system of resources and relationships that exists, the actual organization into which we choose to intervene. And as you can appreciate, as I'm sure you can appreciate, the outcome of that is always unpredictable. We absolutely can't know what effect our action will have if we intervene into any social system, even in a team, let alone in an organization or a country. Right. So the question then for us is, if we stick with this complexity worldview, right, or if we make a leap from the mechanistic worldview to the complexity worldview, what does that mean for the research in strategy and performance management? Right? That's the question that Flavio asked me to look at, because this is a research conference, right? And of course, I'm a researcher as well. And so what I'll do in the next two parts here is talk about what this means, what I believe the complexity paradigm means for researching strategic change and performance management as well. Starting with strategic change, what I'll do here, I apologize, this is going to be a relatively complicated model that I'm going to build. But my colleague Cliff Bowman and I have been trying to outline a general approach to managing strategic change that is firmly rooted in the complexity worldview, right? Is in the complexity theory, in the complexity logic. So we've said that systems are built from individual actions, right? So we have to start on the level of the individual actions. And we know that at some points, actions form patterns. So the interactions between different people produces a pattern. And from actions, we get, in the organizational sense, we get a routine. And there is quite a lot of work on the emergence of organizational routines as well. The point, however, here is that the actions are not analytically aggregated into a routine, right? They produce a routine in an emergent way. We can't really predict how it happens. We can't really design a routine. And once a routine is there, it's a qualitatively different level of structure. That's a qualitatively different thing. So that's why I have two separate boxes here, right? To indicate the fact that this is a process, but it's not a continuous process, right? It's a process that that needs to jump through a threshold. And of course, once a routine is formed, it begins to exert downward causal pressure on the actions. So it will keep actions that are consistent with the routine, and it will drive out actions that contradict it. Right? That's what a routine is. That's how you get stability. That's how you get predictability. And that's how you get structure. For example, again, if you think about culture as a big routine, once it's formed, it will encourage reinforcing behavior and it will discourage deviant behavior. So that's kind of the basic mechanism of how structure forms under complexity and evolution as well here. So if we use this, if we extend this to the study of strategic change throughout levels of analysis, right? What happens? And that's the question that my colleague Cliff Bowman and I have asked in this paper. So we've got a number of actions. Some of them produce the right interaction that allows them to be patterned into routine. So we have routine that is then a relatively stable, predictable, recognizable pattern of action. But of course, routines themselves can do the same thing, and they can get patterned into bigger structures, into high-level structures, into organizations. So some routines will be chosen, and they will become the foundation for the next level of stability in the organization. And of course, the process continues, right? We have organizations that synergize with each other and produce ecosystems, populations in general, I would say, but it could be industries, could be ecosystems, right? Could be clusters. So what we have done is we have a way of building patterns of action, a way of building structure that crosses different levels of organizing. And if we map this onto the literature, we've got the micro question: how routines are produced by actions. We've got the meso questions: how organizations are produced by routines. And I think the dynamic capabilities literature is right in there, although I'm not a big fan of dynamic capabilities. And then we have the macro question of how organizations form ecologies, right? How organizations form populations. And what it allows us to do is to produce a coherent, consistent, and parsimonious look at strategic change that is firmly rooted in the assumptions of the complexity paradigm. So that's the framework. What does it actually mean for researching or strategic change, right? That's the question that I'd like to try and answer in this presentation. I think if we talk about change, I think it's helpful to kind of separate it into two ways of looking at it. Looking at intent, so actually driving change, and looking at inertia, looking at how organizations resist change and push it out. So what I'm going to show you now is a relatively busy table, but please don't let it scare you. I'll walk you through it in a very logical way. So what I'm trying to capture in this table is a set of implications for the research in strategy, in strategic change, on the basis of approaching it from a complex systems view, on the basis of this model that I've just showed you. So if we look at strategic intent, then there is a literature on strategic intent, and of course, key authors there are the Hamel and Prahalad, who started this conversation, and Robert Bergelman as well. If you look inside that literature, there's quite a lot of confusion about what strategic intent really is, who has it, does it reside on the level of individuals? So do individuals have strategic intent, or is it a general strategic direction of the organization? What is it, right? But if we see strategic change in the way I've described it here, we can very firmly put it on the organizational level. We can say that individual people have intentions, and these intentions coalesce in an emergent way into a general emergent pattern, I would say, emergent pattern or emergent property of the organization that could be described as strategic intent of the organization. That is bigger than that of individual people. What it also means, though, is, as I said here in the last column, is we can talk about how discourse and action are related. Because if an executive formulates an intention for the organization, right? So I want this organization to be an agile organization in 3 years, right? That's an individual intention formulated at the level of the organization. But of course, looking at it through the complex systems view will tell us that, well, that's just a wish. In order for that wish to be actioned or to be realized, it would have to be repatterned several times. So the routines would have to be repatterned. The structure of routines themselves into the organization has to be repatterned. And the outcome of that is absolutely unpredictable, because we don't know how individual actions form routines, and we don't know how routines form organizations. So it might be possible to claim or to articulate a strategic intent by an individual, but whether or not it will change the overall strategic intent of the organization or how it will do it is very difficult to see, predict, or engineer. And very similarly, we can ask certain questions about the conversation about strategic leadership in the strategic change literature. Because if you think about it, any action initiated by anyone in the organization is still individual action. So even if it's a CEO signing a policy into action, even if it's a top manager making a decision, that is still an individual action. How that action will enter the big pattern of actions that the organization is, God only knows, right? It's very tempting, especially for executives, to think that they can design patterns of actions. But we know from the study of complex systems that it's impossible. It's an impossible task to do. And of course, in terms of strategy making, the good old debate about whether strategy is formulated or whether it's emergent, I think that conversation has been put to rest a long time ago by Henry Mintzberg and his colleagues. But I think what we could ask, the questions that we could ask about strategic change using this model is where emergence takes place. Where is the center of emergence? Who is really driving change? Where those routines are really changing? So the locus of emergence rather than where it is. Because, for example, it could be that the real strategy is being, as we speak, is being formulated by the middle managers somewhere in the organization. It could be that it's being formulated by your customers interacting with your sales staff. It could very well be that it's formulated and it's being enacted by the executives, but we don't know. And the question of who is driving emergence, who is driving the appearance of new strategy is an open question. I think it's a very useful question to ask in strategic management. And of course, what in fact emerges is another really big question for some of the reasons we've already discussed. The idea that you can't design patterns of actions in an engineering fashion. And of course, looking at inertia, a couple of questions here as well, a couple of implications for studying strategic change from the viewpoint of inertia, the resistance to change. We've talked about punctuated equilibrium, the episodic change, the idea that change is not incremental and is not, in many cases, is not observable. And if we look at this through the lens of this model, right, which is formulated on the basis of complexity theory assumptions, we can then ask about what the mechanisms of inertia really are. So Gersig, for example, a long time ago in the 90s was talking about deep structures. So organizations have deep structures, but what are they? What are the deep structures? But here we can, for example, theorize that the deep structures might be located in the configurations or ecologies of interconnected routines, providing the selection environment for actions, right? So actually constraining certain actions. And also we can ask quite useful questions, I think, and quite powerful questions about how change at different levels, or how changes at different levels are connected. Because, for example, if you have a routine that is nicely chugging along and it's incrementally changing and it's a nice and stable routine, but at the level of the organization, the environment is changing very quickly, and the organization itself needs to be deselected, right? Or needs to change, then the entire ecologies of routines will have to disappear. So if we're looking at multiple levels of structure at the same time, we can ask the question of whether they are connected, whether the dynamics between the dynamics of different levels of structures are connected, and how are they connected. The idea of emergence and the idea of qualitative novelty, right, that you can actually get entirely novel structures and entirely novel properties, I think allows us to talk about change in a more fine-grained, more granular fashion. So, for example, we can actually talk about kinds of change. Is the change incremental or is it strategic? And by saying strategic change, does that mean the emergence of new structures or the destruction of old structures? Right? So are we seeing new patterns emerge, or are we seeing old patterns being destroyed? And of course, the idea of inertia itself, I think, can be reconceptualized as selection pressures of higher levels of structure onto the lower levels of structure. So quite a lot of big questions that we can ask about strategic change, about the mechanisms of strategic change, if we look at it through the lens of complexity theory. So that's what I wanted to say about the implications of this for strategic change. But Flavia also asked me to talk about the performance management side of research. And so also some of the big implications of this paradigm of the complexity worldview are exactly in the space of performance measurement and performance management. So a couple of examples here as well. Going back to the idea of context dependence and the fact that individual elements or individual constituent elements of social systems are live people with free will and agency, right? Actually gives us quite a lot of issues, you could say, for the traditional way of researching and doing performance management. So, for example, definitions and measurements are temporary, right? And they're local conventions. Think about customer loyalty, the indicator of customer loyalty, right? Can you measure it? Can you measure customer loyalty by looking at repeat purchases? Well, in certain cases you can, but in certain cases you can't. So, for example, if you have competition and your customers are actively deciding to buy from you repeatedly, then that's a good measure of loyalty, right? Because they have choice, but they choose to go to you. However, if your competition disappears, right? If your competitor across the road closes shop and you're now the only shop in the vicinity, right, in the environment, and your customers are forced to go to you, then repeat purchases are no longer a good indication of customer loyalty. And there are lots of indicators like this, because the very definition of them is a temporary convention, and it's a local convention as well. Stakeholder satisfaction, for example. We can talk about measuring stakeholder satisfaction, but different locales will have different definitions of who stakeholder is. And the way stakeholders are thought about in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, in Russia, and in China is very different. And similarly, of course, even though we treat accounting measures as true measures, right, as good numbers, there are also conventions. So, for example, inventory value is calculated differently under GAAP or IFRS. And so that means that the context is decisive, and that aggregating these things is problematic. A very quick example here that I have, I work a lot at Cranfield with logistics executives, and this is an example from logistics. So truck fill, right? So how do you measure how full your truck is, right? That's going around the roads. Well, it turns out it's a very difficult issue, actually, because do you measure it by volume? Do you measure it by weight? Do you measure it on the way out or on the way out and back? Because for certain, if it's a delivery company, then it only makes sense to measure it on the way out, because on the way back, it will always be empty. But if it's not a delivery company, if it's actually a company that moves stuff around between different warehouses, then you measure it at all legs of the journey. And even the meaning of that indicator itself is in many cases different, because traditionally, in a classic way, we looked at it as the indicator of truck fill as the indicator of efficiency, but also it is now being looked at as an indicator of environmental performance, because it's very tightly connected to the CO2 emissions. And so trying to aggregate all of that data in performance management is very difficult. And it's nearly impossible to normalize or standardize it, because as we know from the study of complex open systems, the context is decisive, and every part of the system is facing a different kind of context that it has to adapt to locally. Designing performance measurement interventions, so introducing performance indicators, acts as a selection pressure in the organization. So, for example, if you think about it, so it's 10:43 on a Tuesday morning, you get a call from a student. Then you have a distressed colleague who is walking into your office saying, I've had enough, I'm going to quit. At the same time, you're working on a request from your dean. Your son calls you and says that he's accidentally locked himself out from home. You have a conference deadline, and you're working on an R&R that's overdue, right? So there are lots of things you could do. How do you decide what to do? In organizations using performance measurement, performance measures and performance targets are placed exactly to nudge you towards the direction that's that the organization wants or expects. But of course, we know that in complex systems and complex social systems like organizations, what we get is unintended consequences. So people start performing to a measure, so to speak. And these unintended consequences could be negative, and that's how we normally study them. That's how we normally look at them. But they could also be positive. So, for example, in many cases, we see that performance indicators or performance targets provoke or stimulate teamwork and group work. So that's another understudied and under-researched implication of complex systems thinking in performance management. And then, of course, this idea of linearity, right? This is actually a quote from a relatively old study on the service profit value chain. And so look at this: a 5-unit increase in employee attitude drives a 1.3 unit increase in customer impression, which in turn drives 0.5% in revenue growth. Right? If you just think about it for a second. What's a unit of attitude anyway, right? An at or something like that. And even if you could capture attitude in a particular unit and express it in a measurable way, how do you act on something as vague as attitude? How do you affect something as vague as attitude? And finally, notice how very implicitly we have the assumption of linearity woven into this. Because this is a linear relationship. So therefore, what it means is that if you need a 50% increase in revenue, all you need to do is increase your employee attitude by 500 units. Right? But you can imagine how realistic this is. It's great for us as academics because it allows us to build models and test them using structural equation modeling. But actually, if you're a manager trying to manage revenue, this is not very helpful because I dare you to tell me how you get a 5-unit increase in employee attitude. So that is problematic in the sense of doing performance measurement or studying performance measurement the way we've always studied it, if we adopt a complexity, the complexity paradigm and the complexity view, complexity worldview. And finally, actually deciding what to measure, deciding what really drives performance is a big question as well. Because, for example, if you're entering a new market, and in this particular case, this is China, right? At first, you might be looking for opportunities, and so you need indicators that allow you to do that. But at some point, the driver of performance changes, and maybe the real driver of your success is now in the network that you have, and so you need a different set of indicators. As you grow, you may need to look at market share, and once you have market share, you may need to look at production efficiency. So designing a performance management system that does this dynamically is very difficult. But we know that this is how complex systems evolve. And the order of this, the order of how it changes, will also be unpredictable as well. And so how to design a performance management system that allows us to do this, right? And that allows us to learn through trial and error and feedback and learning, and still provide the relevant data when we need it, is very difficult. And that's not something that we have at the moment. So looking forward then in terms of performance management, the research that I think we need here is inquiring into the nature of organizational performance. So actually understanding performance not as an outcome of a set of actions, but as an emergent property of a complex system that is not necessarily predictable and is certainly not easy to engineer. Shifting our attentions away from performance measurement instruments and looking at the process of performance management, of how we actually do it, right? Because it's social, because it's convention-based. This is a point that my colleague Pietro Micheli from Warwick makes very often, that one of the issues in performance measurement research here, and one of the implications of looking at performance measurement in complex systems, is that we need to look at it as a broad field of research. So not just focusing on measurement or indicators, but also thinking about the performance information that they produce, how they produce it, how that feeds into decision making, and in general how that all how all of that enables decision making with continuously on a real-time basis within the organization. And of course, the implication of performance measurement being a social activity and intervening into in a complex social system is that we need to understand the behavior behind performance measurement and the behavioral implications of performance measurement, including, of course, the study of unintended consequences. So in terms of the content, that's all I wanted to say. And I know that we've already talked, or I've already talked for a while. So I just want to show you very quickly what we are doing in this space at the moment. What are the current projects and events that we are doing here? In terms of strategic change, the strategy group at Cranfield University, where I work, has formulated sort of a broad approach to strategic management that we call enabled emergence. And that recognizes the fact that we're neither powerless agents in a chaotic world that we can't control at all, nor are we all-powerful engineers where we can design the future the way we want, right? But what we can do is we can enable the organization to emerge at least in a way that is consistent with where we want it to go, right? We can help the organization evolve in a particular direction. And so we call it enabled emergence. I've got two projects with Cliff Bowman here, one looking at strategic change as emergence, and another one looking at the critique of the resource-based view from the viewpoint of complexity theory. I also have a number of PhD projects, PhD students who are working broadly in this space, looking at how intended strategy could be subverted by middle managers, looking at how strategy emergence is articulated, exactly what is that point at which decisions and actions begin to deviate from the plan, right? Well, what does emergent actually look like on the ground? And that's what one of my students is looking at the evolution of strategic intent, at the emergence on the institutional level, where the institutional change is driven not by the big actors, but by the small peripheral actors. and also looking at the practices of management control practices for complexity, for managing complexity and uncertainty. And of course, all of that feeds into our teaching on the MBA and executive MBA, but also on our executive courses, open and customized executive courses. At Cranfield, we have also just announced that we will be looking for an endowed chair. One of our alumni has decided to make a very substantial contribution, a substantial gift to the university, and fund an endowed chair in transformational strategy. So we're looking for more people and more talent in this area as well. And our alumnus who provided the funding for this is quite clear that he's interested in transformational, big, large-scale strategy, not incremental change as well. This is the Oracle of Delphi, which of course gives name to the Delphi method in management research that looks at researching the future, if you can say that. And so what we're doing here with my colleagues at Cranfield and at the University of Groningen is launching an international Delphi study that will run in 2021 and 2022, and will look at the question of, is there an alternative to the control paradigm in management? So if it's not, if our management practices are not based on control, what should they be based on? What is it? What are the alternative practices? What does the performance measurement look like? We're also currently running a number of special issues in journals dedicated to complexity and dynamism. So this is, for example, the International Journal of Operations and Production Management that explicitly invites papers that look at performance measurement and management in complexity, right? In complex organizational settings. This is the editorial team. I'm one of the guest editors as well. We'll open it between January and March next year, and we're looking precisely for complexity-driven approaches to measuring and managing performance in ecosystems, networks, supply chains, organizations, and just thinking about how performance measurement might be different under the assumptions of complexity. Similarly, my colleagues are running a special issue of management accounting research, which is a part of the conversation in performance management, looking at performance measurement in dynamic environments. Very similarly, right? We'll open it between May and August next year, and it looks at performance measurement and management control in crisis and shocks, right? In very, very dynamic environments where you can't control things, right? So how do you actually do performance measurement? How do you implement strategy? The Performance Management Association that runs a conference every 2 years originally planned to run it this year, but of course it was delayed by COVID. We'll run it next year, but it focuses again very clearly on performance management in complex and dynamic environments. And it will run at the University of Groningen. And again, you have the organization team here as well. And the last thing that we are doing with my colleagues, again, at Cranfield, Warwick, and Groningen, is starting to develop funded projects under the broad umbrella of management, of looking for management practices, understanding management practices in the age of complexity. What we're doing at the moment is looking at how critical industries that have been disrupted by COVID-19, how they're handling their performance management systems, how they use their performance management and measurement systems, how they implement strategies, and can we actually learn about what strategy implementation and performance management looks like, almost using COVID-19 and the disruption caused by COVID-19 almost as an extreme case. Right? So that's just about everything that I wanted to say. Just I suppose one last comment and one last slide, because there's lots of interesting stuff that's going on here, and the switch to the complexity paradigm could be quite a big one. It could allow us to do lots of things. And the question is, for me, is where should we direct our efforts, right? Where should we take this big ship? And I think it's incumbent on us as a profession to try and help people do their job, right? To try and help managers manage and leaders lead and strategists strategize. And in that sense, I think we need theories and tools that literally don't force managers to start developing their solutions on the basis of some dubious assumptions, but we need theories and tools that actually give strategies permission to deal with reality. Right? We start with reality, with what the world is, what the world really is, and then we try and see what it means for us in management. And in that sense, I think what we are doing and the direction that we need to take is to help managers act with intention, so still pursuing their goals and still pursuing their objectives in complex social systems. So in the world that is not perfectly malleable and is not perfectly designable. Right? So that's just about everything I wanted to say. This is a picture of Cranfield from above. I think those of you who have been at Cranfield will recognize it. But otherwise, thank you very much for staying until the end of the session. And yeah, the last thing I can say is obrigado pela atenção.
Thank you very much. De nada, Andre. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. From people who doesn't know Cranfield, this is an airport. It's a former Royal Air Force base, so it's quite uncommon to see this in an university, right? Thank you very much. The first comment I have here is that your example of the 10:43 on a Tuesday morning, it's just a coincidence if it happens to any of us, right?
Yes, absolutely. So it came straight from the experience.
Sure. We have many PhD candidates here. I would like to ask if you can give them some recommendation about research projects using complexity theory. I think, in my opinion, the main difficulty here is to set the boundaries using the complexity theory, complexity approach, but how to set the boundaries for the research projects. Not to try to cover everything, but not losing the complexity.
Absolutely, thank you, Flavio. I think you're right. So the conversation about complexity is an overarching kind of big worldview theme, right? You can't research complexity, right? You have to research something specific. And so I think my recommendation would be to focus on an aspect of this story that really resonated with you. So, for example, if what really kind of captures your attention is the idea that organizations don't have clear boundaries, then study ecosystems, for example. Right? There's quite a lot of very current research on ecosystems. So how organizations build systems that allow them to relate to each other and to do things collectively. And we don't know anything about it. We don't know how people develop strategies collectively. We don't know how people measure and manage performance collectively. So there are quite a lot of very specific research questions that you can ask about this. Similarly, if what really speaks to you is the idea that people are dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity, then you can look for specific research questions in that space. So, for example, asking how do managers make decisions in the absence of data, right? So that's a real research question, which sits under the broad umbrella of complexity, but it's much more researchable, much more doable.
Thank you. I have a question here from the audience from Lydia. She asks, what do you consider a realistic long-term strategy?
It's a really good question, because our question I would question the extent to which you can have a long-term strategy. I think what you could have is what Henry Mintzberg has called an umbrella strategy. So, for example, our strategy is to compete on brand, right, or to grow by acquisition, or to compete on supply chain management, right? So, as a principle. But certainly not as a plan, not as a vision that you can project into the future, because I don't think that's realistic at all.
In the same perspective, it's actually my question. At what extent the performance can be measured in a way that in a complex system like this, like you described, what performance is intended, can be intended, and which performance can be intended, and which performance is actually unintended. So what I mean is how can we measure, because we have this mindset of using numbers, figures to everything, to measure everything, but if we don't know what to measure.
Right, great question. I think if you make a switch to the complexity worldview, you can't ask this question anymore, right? Because then performance is it's not an outcome of what we do, so you can't really trace the effects, but it's an emergent property of the system. And I think the only thing you could do is, for example, the only practical thing that I've seen so far is you could use the configurational approach. So instead of looking at what drives performance, right? How the effect on performance is created, you can look at what's important, right? So instead of doing attribution analysis, you do contribution analysis, and you can say this seems to be important, this seems to be important, and another aspect is important. But how it produces the effect on performance, I don't think we can trace it. And in that sense, if you look, I think, at a very recent paper in AMR by Santi Furnari, looking at the configurational approach to strategy, I think that makes that argument very clear. It's almost like you think about recipes for good food, right? You need a bit of sugar and a bit of flour and a bit of water. And a bit of, I don't know, yeast, for example. So you know that these components need to be there, but you don't know how they produce the final taste, right? So that's instead of looking at it as a causal explanation of taste, you're looking at configurational explanation of taste. And I think in many cases in social systems, in organizations, that's what we should look at. Sorry, long answer to your question.
No problem. No
but I really think that's the next
Sure,
horizon.
Sure.
That's the next question.
I have from my side a final question. If you could elaborate a little bit on your critics about research-based view. You mentioned that you don't like, you're not a fan of dynamic capabilities, and you have this. What are Can you give us a spoiler?
I would rather not, in terms of the critique of the RBV that we are writing, because we haven't presented it at any conferences yet. So I'm still working that out. But in terms of the dynamic capabilities, one of the issues that I have with it is it's a concept that is so abstract that I wonder if anybody has ever seen a dynamic capability. I'm not sure what it is, and if I can't operationalize it in a way that I trust it, I find it difficult to believe it. But I know that I'm in the minority here.
No worry. Okay, thank you, Andrea. We don't have other questions from the audience, just some compliments from Sergio Petri, from Vendramini. Of course, for myself, I would like again to thank you for your presentation, for your clarifications and some very important points. And we hope that the next time your presence in our conference will be here in Brazil, in São Paulo. Thank you very much again. If you have a final message, please feel free.
No, I just want to say thank you to you, Flavio. I want to say thank you to Fernando, who is running this behind the scenes, and also to everyone who attended it. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, all the audience, everybody in the organization. Thank you. Hope to see you in the next sessions.